Chapter 26 Reunions. Kendra awoke feeling oddly empty. It was several moments before she realized that it was the absence of pain. She opened her eyes on an unfamiliar ceiling, which was not so surprising as it might once have been. Waking up somewhere foreign had become the rule of late. She ran her fingers over her head and nodded distantly. The ears were still there. They had not just been a dream.
"So, you're finally awake, are you?"
Kendra flinched at the sound of the voice, a few paces away. The room that had floated around her, unimportant and indistinct, came into sharp focus. She lay on a pile of blankets to one edge of a small stone hall. For a moment, she felt her stomach plunge, but it was unmistakably different from the labyrinth of dilapidated passages beneath the Hill of the Lost. She was in a dome, perhaps 10 paces across, with what appeared to be a bisected glass bubble running around the edges of the room, spackled with points of white. The walls beyond were pitch-black stone, while the floor was marble frescoed a grassy green. At the crown of it all was a small hole, from which daylight reflected down over the room. It was a moving star map, Kendra realized, and a marvel of craftsmanship, but her wonder was somehow muted. As her inspection made its way down the room, she lowered her gaze to the figure sitting at the far side of the hall, and was offered another surprise. "Boris!" she rasped in shock, then paused. She could barely speak.
"I imagine your throat has to be dreadfully parched. Here."
With slow, deliberate movements, he pulled forth a water skin and slid it firmly across the smooth floor to her. After staring at it for several moments, she nodded her thanks and drank greedily. She could not remember ever feeling so painfully dry. Before she knew it, she had emptied it and gasped for breath. As she did, she stared, trying to begin to think of what to say. Finally, she managed a weak, "What happened?" Boris nodded patiently, stroking his beard.
"Well, rather a lot has happened since last I saw you, though I gather you've in fact seen me a little more recently than I've seen you. But you've not missed much. Maybe a day. I'll keep it simple. We caught up with your friends, finally, only to find out you'd been taken. Needless to say, we came running about as quick as we could to come and get you, but it took some doing. It's a real mess down there under the hill. It took most of the day to find you, and you were in damned rough shape by the time we did. I'm sorry."
Kendra nodded, at a loss for words. She could remember more and more as her mind cleared, and she wanted none of it. "It was pretty bad," she admitted eventually, tears brimming in her eyes, but not actually falling. "The worst, actually."
"You're right at that, Miss Kendra," he agreed quietly. "You survived something properly terrible. But you are safe now. After we came and got you, that thing, it was buried in the rubble. I wouldn't bet that it'll kill it, but we should be safe enough for the moment."
They were quiet for a time then, sitting across from each other. Absently, Kendra watched to see if there were fractional movements of the painted stars, but it was hard to tell.
"How are you feeling?"
Boris eventually asked, breaking the silence.
"I can guess, but is there anything you need?"
Kendra laughed, or she tried to. The sound was choked and awful, and almost immediately she stopped herself. "I'm not as bad as I could be, I suppose," she said dully. "Mostly tired, I guess. Yeah, tired." She rubbed her face, and noted with resignation that the right side was as rough and scarred as ever it had been, even after. She shuddered. She couldn't think about that. Not yet.
"You could go back to sleep," Boris offered. "If you're tired, there's no crime in getting the rest you need."
She shook her head. "I'm not tired like I need sleep, Boris," she said. "Just tired. You know Moira is dead, right?" It was more statement than question, and he nodded somberly. "I should feel guilty about that, I think," she went on heavily. "She wouldn't be here if I hadn't gotten myself into this mess. Neither would you. So many people got caught up in the wake of my mistakes, but I don't feel anything about it. I'm just tired. Does that make me a monster?"
Boris frowned thoughtfully. "You know," he said ponderously, "I've never really had much use for guilt. Not my own or anyone else's. Maybe that's a bit self-serving of me, but it just doesn't seem to do much good at the end of the day. Whatever's happened, whatever you blame yourself for, I don't need you to beat yourself up over it. I reckon you've been plenty beaten up already. You've been through a hell of a lot, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm just glad to see you alive. It's more than I dared hope for."
One of the tears that hadn't fallen slipped out now, and she smiled honestly. It was ugly and unpracticed, the burns twisting one corner down strangely, but for once she was almost beyond caring. With a quick wipe of her eyes and a grateful nod, she swallowed. "So," she went on, a little more steadily, "who is we? You said we caught up with Caleb and Maya. Someone else from the caravan made it all this way?"
"No, actually," Boris said, a little too casually. "It was just me and Moira that fell in the drink together that night, or at least I didn't find anyone else. I think most of our boys and girls made it through all right, and are still on the other side of the river, gods be praised. No, this was a more recent companion. Remind me to tell you about our run-in with the satyr sometime. It was rather more adventure than I've had in a long time, for better or worse. It might be that I'm getting too old for such foolishness, because I managed to get myself pretty well knocked around. Well, I recovered with Miss Medusa for a few days. Lovely woman, by the way. She speaks very highly of you. Anyway, I was up and about just as quick as I could be, and maybe a little quicker than I ought to have been. I was stumping through the woodlands the best I could, when I met a little fella who just about ran me over, he was going so fast. Terribly upset he was. After a minute, I got the idea that he knew you, and had a pretty decent idea where to find you, somehow or another. Maybe you remember him? A scrawny little fella, goes by the name of Adrian."
Kendra gasped and lurched forward, leaning in towards where Boris sat with a faint smile. "Adrian?" she asked hurriedly, her eyes wide. "Adrian's here with you?"
My, Boris drawled. "You weren't nearly so excited to see me again."
Kendra colored, abashed, but he snorted.
"Only fooling, Miss Kendra. Yes, Adrian is just outside, along with the rest of your friends. He about tore the hill apart trying to find you, he was in such a state. I've never seen anything quite like it. I think he pretty well wore himself out, too, because he's been sleeping just about since we got clear of that mess."
He paused, inspecting her closely.
"Would you like to go out and see him?"
Kendra ran her hands through her hair. She was not sure she could put a name to all the feelings that were surging through her now. She had missed Adrian terribly, worse than she cared to admit. She had done him irreparable harm, and she had no right to wish to see him again. And yet he had come back for her, had pulled her out of hell. Her lip quivered, but she swallowed, and finally she nodded. Boris rose with a confident grace that belied his age and stocky figure. Kendra supposed that his true age was far greater than she could have ever imagined, but he cut into her idle speculation, beckoning from the narrow door set into the hinge of the glass dome. A little unsteadily, she got to her feet and crossed to follow him, stepping into the passage beyond. It was a tidy hallway, its masonry sharp and exacting. Each stone seemed to be set into the next with excruciating precision, but it was otherwise quite plain, almost an exercise in blankness. Kendra turned, and there they were. Caleb was pacing back and forth, almost buzzing with repressed anxiety. Maya leaned against a wall, her arms crossed, her expression stony. And behind them, a loose bundle of blankets was pushed into a corner in a disordered heap. Kendra tried for a small smile and waved. "Hello," she announced meekly. Immediately, Caleb whirled on her. "Kendra!" he cried, hurrying towards her. "Are you all right? I tried to go after you as soon as you fell, but there wasn't any way down I could see, so we had to circle back and find an alternate—" He stopped short as Boris put up a firm hand. "Let her breathe, lad," he said, kind but stern. "Of course," Caleb said in hushed tones, mollified. His face was drawn, and it was a sign of the strain that he did not even object to being referred to as lad. "I was just— Oh, never mind. It's good to see you up and moving again, Kendra." She smiled faintly, but when she spoke, it was heartfelt. "Thank you. It's good to see you too. Really, really good." And it was true. She could feel a knot unwinding in her stomach to see him. It was almost like something normal. Maya approached too, purposefully walking around Boris. Her face was tense, but she gave Kendra a warm nod. "You're a sight for sore eyes, and no mistake, Miss Kendra." She raised her arm as if to clap her on the shoulder, then thought better of it, lowering the hand. "You look good." Kendra stepped in closer and gave the hand a quick squeeze. "You too," she murmured. Then, in an even lower voice, "Are you all right?" Maya shrugged. She did not meet Kendra's eyes. She never did, but still, there was something distant in her face. Kendra was about to ask more, but she, too, thought better of it, her heart heavy. "Sorry I wasn't much help back in the tunnel," Maya eventually said, louder and a little bullishly. "I lost my head. I wasn't there for you when you needed me." She looked angry, but Kendra did not think it was directed at her. Was it her imagination, or had Boris winced? She tried for a nonchalant shrug, and while she was fairly certain she had failed to pull it off, she pushed on regardless. "It's fine," Kendra said with lukewarm cheer. "You're here now. You came back for me, and you got me out. So thank you. You don't know what you rescued me from." Maya looked unconvinced, but her expression softened with sympathy, and she nodded her grudging acknowledgment. "Well, it was mostly that one over there," she capitulated, gesturing back to the huddle of blankets. "I've never seen the power of the sisters in person. It was really something. He very nearly swept away half the hillside. Small wonder he's tired. Kendra walked to where he lay against the wall, small and unassuming, and she stopped dead. It was like a piece of her was returning to its rightful place, one that she'd not known was missing until it was restored. He looked much as she remembered, pale, fragile, and vulnerable. It was hard to imagine him destroying a hillside, but then she remembered that figure of salvation she'd seen through the haze of terror and pain, the black-winged angel. The weight of the debt between them was momentarily crushing. He had saved her life and her mind, and she had killed his brother. For a moment she was in awe of her own audacity to stand here and dare to need him so, dare to even look at him. Her throat tightened, and she almost ran when he opened his eyes. Adrian's eyes were dark and warm as a mug of hot chocolate on her nightstand. He looked up at her, and his face split open into a wide grin, coming alight with a pure joy. It was not innocence or ignorance. There was, as always, that sense of understanding and awareness there, mature on his seemingly youthful face. But there was also a simple and gentle love there, as unmistakable as if the message were embroidered on a banner. With a croaking cry that warbled up almost to song, he leapt into her arms. "Kendra!" "Hello," she said huskily. She wanted to grin down at him, to tell him everything, but the words caught in her throat. Her eyes stung, and she found she could not see clearly. "Missed you." He was muffled, his face firmly lodged into her shoulder, half burrowing, as if he intended to set up roost there. She found she could no longer control the tears. "Yeah, Adrian," she managed. "I missed you too." She had no right to say it, she knew, but she also couldn't not. He loosened his grip ever so slightly in order to look up at her, his face gaunt and intent. "Don't leave me again." He seemed so small in her arms. She wished she could comfort him. Kendra wanted so badly to reassure him and promise him that she would always be there, always. But she also knew that she had a gift for letting people down, and in that moment she could not bear lying to his face. I'll try," she finally said, the tears not letting up for a moment. And somehow, remarkably, that was enough for him. He stayed there and held her as she wept, and when she had started she found there was no stopping. She bawled in that corridor for a long time. She cried for the pain and for this joy of reunion that she did not deserve but could not give up. She cried for Moira and Thomas, and she cried for Adrian and for herself, and for all that she'd lost and all that she'd found. Eventually, she ran herself dry and turned, a little red-eyed, back to the rest of her company. "Sorry about that," she murmured, her throat too raw to speak much louder. "So, what's been happening while I've been gone? Where do we go from here?" They had been standing a respectful distance away, but they greeted her with understanding smiles. Even Maya seemed a bit less terse. "Well," Caleb replied, looking carefully innocent, "first of all, it might be best to get you up to speed on a few things. Where we are now, for instance." Boris groaned. "You, sir, have an overdeveloped sense of drama." Caleb did not deign to respond. He beckoned to Kendra, a bounce in his step, and in spite of her wariness, she rose with a little grin. "This way," he called, stepping around a corner. "I think this might give you a good idea." Kendra followed, and her mouth fell open in awe. The corridor ended, opening up into an immense space. They overlooked a circular shaft that rose far above them and fell far below. This hollow core gave a view of the many crisscrossing platforms, staircases, and stories that sprawled up and down its edges. They seemed chaotic and mismatched, layout and architecture changing styles seemingly on a whim, but somehow it all flowed together in some coherent pattern, clearly laid out with intention and a plan, even if she could not fully understand it. There was, however, one element that was the same wherever she looked. Every open surface was crammed with row upon row of books. It was almost mind-boggling in scale. It utterly dwarfed the library of the living city, and it made her beloved collection back home look like an acorn beside an ancient oak. It was a wonder that stood above any she had seen on her journey, and even tired and battered, it took her breath away. "Beautiful," she whispered. "It's unbelievable," Caleb said, his voice hushed and reverent. "There are a few records of it, but they don't do it the least bit of justice. Welcome, Kendra, to the citadel of the Witch of Words, the Library of Genevieve."